Tonight we are going to sit quietly with a story that most people only think they have finished watching. Season 4 of Classroom of the Elite has aired, 16 episodes carrying us through the first half of the second year at the Advanced Nurturing High School, and if you have only ever seen the anime, then you have seen the shape of these events, but not their weight. The camera has shown you what happened. It has shown you people meeting in quiet rooms, a knife appearing where a knife should never be, a long survival exam on a distant island, and a boy who moves through all of it with the same unreadable calm he has always carried. What the camera did not show you, what it almost never shows you, is the reasoning underneath. And that is what we are going to explore, slowly and without any hurry, across the quiet hours ahead. Not to argue that the anime is bad, because it is not, but simply to fill in the pieces that were left in shadow, so that the whole thing settles into place the way it was originally written. So we begin where the story itself really begins, which is not with events at all, but with a person, and more precisely with the inside of a single head, the head the anime keeps sealed shut. Before the new faces that arrived that spring, before the schemes in the Long Island summer and everything that came after, there is simply him, Ayanokoji Kiyotaka, and the quiet machinery of his thinking that the adaptation set so gently to one side. Let it just be him for a while. Let it just be the mind the whole story is really about. Here is the thing to understand before anything else, and it is the single most important cut of the entire season. The light novels are told, for the most part, from Ayanokoji's own point of view. You are inside his narration. You hear him notice things, weigh them, discard some, keep others, and arrive at decisions through long, quiet chains of reasoning. His voice is the engine of the whole series. It is the reason a scene where two students simply talk can feel like a chess match played 3 moves ahead. When that voice is removed, and in the anime it is almost entirely removed, you are left watching the pieces move on the board without ever being told why. The anime shows you the act. The novel shows you the 10 small steps of thought that came before the act. And so a person who has only watched has, without knowing it, been reading the last page of every calculation while the working was erased. Think of it like watching a magician from across a crowded room. You see the coin vanish and reappear, and it looks like magic, effortless and a little cold. But if you were standing close, you would see the tiny movements, the misdirection, the patience, the practice. The anime seats you across the room. The novel seats you at his shoulder. Tonight we are going to sit at his shoulder for a while. It helps to understand just how much of the ordinary surface of this story is transformed by that closeness, because it is not only the dramatic moments that change. Consider something as small as a conversation, 2 students standing in a hallway, exchanging a few polite sentences about a class matter. In the anime, that is exactly what it appears to be, a brief and unremarkable exchange, and you move on. In the novel, the very same exchange arrives wrapped in a running current of assessment. He is noticing which words the other person chose and which they avoided, what their eyes did when a certain name came up, whether the friendliness is genuine or a probe, what they might want, what they might already know, and what they are hoping he will reveal. A conversation that lasts 20 seconds on screen can carry a full page of quiet evaluation underneath it, and none of that page survives the adaptation. So when I say the anime turns the sound off, I mean it almost literally. Whole scenes that feel like idle small talk are, in the source, dense with silent reading of other people, and the boy doing the reading never once lets his face show that he is doing it. Let us begin where the season's tension first turns sharp, with the moment the anime treats as its most shocking image, the knife. If you watched, you remember it. A confrontation among the first-year building, a boy from the new class producing a blade, a sudden lunge, and Ayanokoji putting his own hand in the way so that the knife passes through his palm rather than into anyone's body. In the anime, this lands as a gasp. It looks like a reckless act of courage, or perhaps a strange, self-destructive impulse from a character we already suspect is not ordinary. It looks like something done on instinct, and that reading is precisely the thing the novel spends its hidden narration dismantling, because in the novel, almost nothing Ayanokoji does is on instinct. It is arithmetic. To see it the way it was written, you have to understand what the boy with the knife was actually trying to do, and this is the first piece the anime quietly withholds. The threat was never really about stabbing Ayanokoji. A student who simply stabbed another student would be caught, expelled, and gain nothing. The real plan was far more careful and far more cruel. The plan was to turn the knife on himself, to press it into his own thigh, and then to accuse Ayanokoji of the wound. To manufacture an assault that never happened, using a real injury and a real weapon, so that the school would have no choice but to remove Ayanokoji from the academy entirely. It was a frame. The blade was not meant to take blood from Ayanokoji at all. It was meant to take blood from its own wielder and hang the blame around Ayanokoji's neck. Now hold that in your mind and watch the same moment again, but this time from inside his reasoning, the way the pages give it to you. He is not surprised by the knife. He has been expecting a blade for some time because the pieces had been arranged too neatly in the days before, small signs left in places a careful person would notice, a trail that told him a weapon was coming and roughly how it would be used. So when the moment arrives, he is not reacting. He is executing a plan he has already thought through, and the plan is not to dodge, because dodging solves nothing, it simply leaves the frame intact for the next attempt. The plan is to make it impossible for the frame to work at all. So he moves toward the knife rather than away from it, and he takes the blade through his own left hand. This is the part that looks insane from across the room and looks inevitable from his shoulder. By wounding himself on the attacker's forward motion, he guarantees that the blade cannot then be turned into a self-inflicted wound used against him, because the blade is now already accounted for, already bloodied, already in a story that runs the other direction. And here the hidden reasoning fans out into a whole quiet list, the kind of list the novel lets you hear and the anime cannot. The fingerprints on the handle are not his. The blood that has been spilled marks the person who brought and swung the weapon. And in a further twist that the anime has no room to explain, the ownership of the knife itself has been arranged so that the trail of evidence points back toward the attacker rather than toward Ayanokoji, because the attacker had been seen trying to obtain exactly such a blade. Every thread that was supposed to strangle Ayanokoji has been rerouted in a single motion to bind the person holding the knife instead. There is a quieter layer beneath even this, and it is the layer that most rewards sitting close. For the counter to work so cleanly, a great deal had to be true before the knife ever appeared, and the novel lets you feel that he had been shaping those conditions, or at least reading them, well ahead of time. He did not simply react well in the instant. He arrived in the instant already holding the pieces he would need, already aware of who had handled what, already certain of the details that would later decide whose story the school would believe. The anime, forced to compress, gives you a boy who does a startling thing very fast. The pages give you a boy for whom the startling thing was the slow, obvious conclusion of a problem he had been turning over quietly for days, so that when it finally came, there was almost nothing left to decide. That is the strange stillness people notice in him. It is not emptiness. It is the calm of someone who finished his thinking long before the moment everyone else considers the beginning. None of that internal accounting is spoken in the anime. In the anime you see a hand, a blade and blood, and you are left to feel the shock of it. In the novel you hear a mind that has already walked 10 steps down the corridor and is simply waiting for everyone else to arrive. That is the difference we're talking about across this entire season, and the knife is only its clearest, sharpest example. What looks like sacrifice is really calculation. What looks like a wound is really a lock clicking shut on someone else's plan. There is something worth sitting with here, gently, because it tells you who this character is. He chose an injury to his own body as the cleanest available move, not because he enjoys pain and not because he is careless with himself, but because in the arithmetic of that instant it was simply the most efficient path to the outcome he wanted, and the cost, a wound to the hand that would heal, was one he was willing to pay. The anime cannot tell you that he weighed the cost. It can only show you that he paid it. And so the version of him that lives in the minds of anime-only viewers is a little more mysterious, a little more like a force of nature, and a little less like what he actually is, which is a person who treats his own body as one more resource on the table to be spent when the math is favorable. Let us drift now from that single sharp scene into the broader pattern that runs beneath the whole season, because the cut narration is not only about big dramatic moments. It is also about the 1,000 small choices where Ayanokoji decides, quietly, to be less than he is. This is perhaps the hardest thing for anime-only viewers to fully feel, because it is made almost entirely of interior thought. Throughout the second year, as through everything before it, Ayanokoji is deliberately hiding the true extent of his ability. He does not want to be seen. He does not want to be measured. His entire aim, the aim he has carried since he first arrived at the school, is to blend into the middle of the crowd and live an ordinary student life, and every time his real capability threatens to surface, he presses it back down under the water on purpose. In the novel you are constantly aware of this pressure, because you are inside the mind doing the pressing. You hear him decide, in 100 quiet ways, to answer a question a little worse than he could, to let someone else take the credit for a plan he really shaped, to stand at the edge of a room and let events run their course when he could have ended them in a sentence. The anime, having no access to that inner voice, can only show you a boy who often does nothing, who often hangs back, who often seems strangely passive while more dramatic characters charge ahead. And so a viewer who has only watched might reasonably come away thinking he is simply reserved, or lucky, or that the story keeps handing him easy victories. The truth the pages give you is almost the opposite. He is not passive. He is exercising an enormous, constant restraint, and that restraint is itself the performance. Doing nothing, when you could do everything, is one of the most demanding things a person can do, and the novel lets you feel how much effort goes into his apparent stillness. You can see this restraint most clearly in the way he handles his own class, and here it is worth pausing, because it is easy to miss how much of the class's progress is really his doing. On the surface, and certainly in the anime, it is Horikita who leads. She is the one who stands at the front, who argues, who negotiates, who makes the decisions the class follows, and that is exactly how he wants it to look. What the interior narration reveals is how often the idea she is defending, or the angle she has chosen, or the timing of a particular move, was quietly nudged into place by a few words he offered earlier in private, framed so lightly that she could believe the conclusion was entirely her own. He is not interested in being seen to lead. He is interested in the outcome, and he has learned that the surest way to reach a good outcome without exposing himself is to grow the people around him into the roles the situation needs, and then to step back and let them stand in the light while he watches from its edge. On screen, this can look like a boy who simply supports his classmate. In the pages, it is something far more deliberate, a patient, almost invisible cultivation of other people as instruments, done so gently that even the instruments rarely notice they are being played. This is why the question that anime viewers often ask, the question of why he does not simply win, why he does not just crush every obstacle openly, is answered so completely in the prose and left so open on the screen. He does not win openly because winning openly is the one thing he cannot afford. To reveal the full shape of his ability would be to lose the ordinary life he is trying to protect, to draw the attention of the very people he is trying to slip away from, and to turn every future exam into a hunt with himself as the prey. So he wins in the dark instead. He wins by arranging things so that the visible victory belongs to someone else, usually to Horikita or to the class as a whole, while his own hand stays out of the light. When you watch the anime, you see the class succeed and you see him standing quietly nearby, and it can look like coincidence. When you read the novel, you understand that the coincidence was authored carefully by the quiet boy in the corner who made sure his name would never be the one written on the outcome. Carry that understanding with you into the long stretch of the season that unfolds on the island, the summer survival exam that fills so much of the second year's first half, because it is there that his hidden restraint becomes almost a discipline in itself. The exam is enormous and physically punishing, 2 weeks of moving across rough terrain, scoring points by reaching designated areas before rival groups, managing food and water and sleep, and the constant risk of penalties. It is exactly the kind of test where a truly exceptional person could seize the top of the rankings by force, and Ayanokoji in the novel is completely aware of that, which is precisely why he does not do it. The interior discipline of the island is really a discipline of visibility, and it runs through every day of those 2 long weeks. A great deal of the exam comes down to points earned by reaching certain places before rival groups do, and a person who wanted to could chase every reward aggressively, appearing again and again at the front of the rankings, drawing every eye. Ayanokoji, in the narration, treats his own score almost like a dial he is holding at a careful setting. Too low and he risks the danger that comes to the bottom of the standings. Too high and he risks the far greater danger of being noticed, of people asking how an unremarkable student is suddenly outpacing the strongest groups in the year. So he threads the middle on purpose, day after day, spending just enough effort to stay safe and no more, and every time the easy temptation to seize a larger lead presents itself, you hear him quietly decline it. It is a strange kind of endurance, the endurance of holding yourself below your own ceiling for 2 weeks while your body is exhausted, and the simplest thing in the world would be to let your real ability show. The anime can only give you the tiredness. The novel gives you the tiredness and the constant small refusals underneath it. Watch the anime and you see him endure the island, quietly competent, never quite dominating, and at the end you see the top of the standings belong to someone else, to the flamboyant Koenji, who sweeps the exam and takes the highest score by a wide margin. It can look on screen as though Ayanokoji simply came up short, as though someone finally outperformed him. But inside the reasoning that the anime removes, you understand that placing at the very top was never his goal, and in fact was something to be avoided. To finish first in a contest of raw ability would have been to announce himself to everyone watching, to the school, to the rival classes, and to the people who already suspect what he is. So instead he manages his own performance the way a swimmer might hold a steady pace while hiding how fast he could really go, staying strong enough to matter, quiet enough to disappear, and letting the loud, undeniable Koenji absorb all the attention that comes with the crown. The novel lets you hear him make that choice deliberately. The anime can only show you the result and let it look like a limit rather than a decision. And underneath even that, all through the island, his mind is doing something the anime almost never lets you see, which is reading the people around him as continuously and carefully as he reads the exam itself. There is a first-year student who has attached herself to him during the exam, someone the anime presents as a slightly odd, slightly intense girl who happens to be nearby. From his shoulder in the novel, you understand that he never once takes her presence at face value. He is aware quietly and constantly that she is not what she pretends to be, that her closeness is not accidental, and that she is very likely there because someone wants him gone. He does not confront this openly, because confronting it openly would give away how much he knows. He simply files it, watches, waits, and keeps the knowledge in reserve, the way he keeps everything in reserve, until the moment it becomes useful. We will come to who that girl actually is before very long, and so she can stay mostly in the shadows for the moment, because what matters right now is the mind observing her, the steady, unhurried attention that the anime cannot show because it lives entirely in thought. By the time the island exam reaches its final stretch, that hidden watchfulness pays off in a confrontation the anime treats as sudden danger, and the novel treats as something Ayanokoji had, in his own way, been prepared for all along. Without opening up the whole of that threat just yet, it is enough to say that the season's closing danger is not a surprise to him in the way it is a surprise to the audience. Where the viewer feels a jolt of alarm as the danger reveals itself, the reader feels the quiet click of a suspicion being confirmed. He had already sensed the shape of the thing coming for him. He had already thought through what he would and would not reveal, how much of himself he could afford to use, and what the consequences of each choice would be. And so his composure in that final confrontation, which on screen can look almost inhumanly cold, is in the pages simply the calm of a person who has done his thinking well in advance, and is now watching a plan he half expected arrive more or less on schedule. This is the texture of his mind that the anime, by its nature, must leave out, and it is worth naming plainly what that costs because it is not nothing. Without the interior voice, Ayanokoji becomes a puzzle rather than a person. He becomes the boy who always seems to be a step ahead by some unexplained magic, the boy whose calm can read as arrogance or emptiness, the boy whose choices look like luck or like cruelty depending on the light. With the interior voice restored, he becomes something quieter and, in a strange way, more human. He becomes a person who is exhausted by his own restraint, who spends his own body like currency when the math demands it, who protects an ordinary life he is not even sure he wants, and who watches the people around him with a loneliness that the narration lets you feel even when he never says it aloud. The anime gives you the mask. The novel lets you feel the face underneath the mask and the tiredness in it. It is worth being honest, too, about where the line sits between what is written and what is guessed, because this series invites a great deal of guessing, and part of understanding it well is knowing which is which. The specific reasoning behind a scene like the knife, the chain of evidence, the anticipation, the deliberate self-injury, that is drawn directly from his narration in the pages and is as solid as anything in the story. The broader pattern, the constant hiding of his ability, the choice to let others take the visible wins, the discipline of finishing beneath his true capacity, that too is established again and again across the books and is not a fan theory. But there are always corners of this character that even the novels leave deliberately dim, moments where his true feelings are withheld from the reader as carefully as they are withheld from the other students, and it is worth holding those corners loosely. When the narration goes quiet even for us, it is usually on purpose, and the honest thing is to admit that some of what Ayanokoji feels is left, intentionally, as a space the story does not fill. Tonight we have stayed with what the pages actually give us, and let the deliberate silences remain silent. So let this be the thought to carry quietly onward. The season you may have watched is, in a sense, the same story told with the sound turned off. Every event is there. The knife is there, the island is there, the long summer and its quiet dangers are all there. What is missing is the low, steady voice underneath it all, the voice that turns a shocking image into a solved problem and a passive boy into the most active mind in the room. Once you can hear that voice, even faintly, the whole season rearranges itself, and the things that looked like instinct or luck reveal themselves as choices, made slowly in the dark, by someone who would very much prefer you never noticed him making them. And there is one more thing the anime softened, gently and almost kindly, that we are going to turn to next. The new students who arrived that spring, the ones the anime kept behind a veil of mystery, were not really mysterious at all in the novels. They had names and histories and reasons, and one of them in particular carried a grief so specific and so quietly devastating that leaving it out changes the meaning of everything she does. So rest here for a moment with the boy and his hidden mind, and when you are ready, we will go and meet the girl who was sent to destroy him and learn why. Her name is Nanase Tsubasa, and she is, on the surface of the anime, one of the season's small, quiet mysteries. a first-year student, soft-spoken and composed, who appears again and again at the edges of the trouble that follows Ayanokoji through those early weeks, usually somewhere near the loud and violent Hosen, the boy who brought the knife. If you have only watched, you probably filed her the way the anime invites you to file her, as the calm girl standing beside the dangerous one, another piece of the first-year threat, present and watchful and not quite explained. And that is exactly the shape the adaptation leaves her in, a mysterious girl who seems to be working with Hosen, and very little more. The novels give her something the anime almost entirely withholds, which is a reason. Not a vague reason, not a plot function, but a private grief so specific and so quietly ruinous that once you know it, every soft thing she says takes on a second meaning, and the calm on her face stops looking like mystery and starts looking like a wound she is carrying very carefully so that no one will see it move. It is easy watching to let her slip past you, because everything about her surface is designed to be unremarkable. She is polite, she is gentle, she speaks softly and rarely raises her voice, and she carries herself with the sort of mild, agreeable calm that makes a person forgettable in a crowd. The anime leans on that surface because the surface is all it can show, and so she reads as a background presence, a quiet first-year who happens to keep turning up wherever Ayanokoji's troubles are gathering. Even her placement in the school, down among the lower first-year class, the way Ayanokoji's own class once sat at the bottom, tends to make a viewer underestimate her, to file her as minor as scenery. And that, in a strange way, is the anime accidentally doing to the audience exactly what Nanase does to everyone around her, presenting a soft and harmless exterior that keeps anyone from looking too closely at what is underneath. The difference is that the anime does it by omission, and Nanase does it on purpose, and the purpose is to hide a grief she's been carrying since she was a child. To understand her, you have to begin with the things she reveals to Ayanokoji not long after Hosen's knife scheme falls apart, because it reframes the entire behavior of the first years around him. She tells him plainly that there is a price on his head. Somewhere above all of them, a reward has been set, and the terms are simple and cold. Any first-year student who manages to get Ayanokoji expelled from the school will receive 20 million private points. It is worth pausing on that number, gently, because private points are the spendable currency of this school, the money the students live on, and 20 million of them is a fortune beyond anything an ordinary student could ever accumulate through good behavior or good grades. It is the kind of sum that could buy a person almost anything the school has to offer, and it has been dangled in front of an entire year group with a single name attached to it, his. So the hostility that surrounds him is not random, and it is not simply the temper of one violent boy. It is a hunt, quietly announced, with him as the prize, and Nanase is the one who lifts the curtain enough to let him see it. The novel is careful about where that reward comes from, and it matters because it is not Nanase's doing. She did not set the price, she merely knows about it. The bounty comes from the same direction as almost every shadow in Ayanokoji's life, from the White Room and the people acting on its behalf, reaching into the school through the man serving as acting head of the institution during this stretch of the story, a man whose loyalties belong not to the students, but to Ayanokoji's father. The father who built the White Room, the father who has never stopped wanting his son back inside it. And so the 20 million points are really an extended arm of that same old pressure, an attempt to turn the boy's own classmates and juniors into the instrument of his removal, so that the school itself does the work the White Room cannot do openly. The anime shows you first-years who dislike Ayanokoji. The novel shows you first-years who have been quietly turned into bounty hunters by a power none of them fully understand, and it lets you feel how lonely it is to walk through your days knowing that almost everyone younger than you has been given a reason to want you gone. Sit with what that reward actually does to the people who hear of it, because it is a genuinely poisonous thing to release into a school. It does not simply make a few students hostile. It quietly corrupts the ordinary trust between year groups, turns every friendly first-year face into a possible calculation, and makes it impossible to know whether a person approaching you means it or is simply measuring the distance to 20 million points. For someone in Ayanokoji's position, whose entire strategy depends on being underestimated and left alone, it is close to the worst thing that could be done short of open violence, because it multiplies the number of people who are watching him and gives each of them a private reason to move against him at any moment. And Nanase stands inside that poisoned field as one of the few who could tell him the shape of it, which means that from very early on she occupies a strange double position, both a part of the threat surrounding him and quietly, one of the only people willing to describe that threat to his face. The novel lets you feel how unusual that is, and how much it should have told him, and did tell him, about who she really was underneath. Now, if that were the whole of Nanase, she would still be more interesting than the anime allows, but she would not be the quiet heartbreak of this half of the story. Because here is the deeper cut, the thing the adaptation simply does not have the interior room to carry. Nanase's true motive has nothing to do with the money. The bounty is real, and she moves within its shadow, but she is not chasing it. What drives her is older and far more personal, and it reaches back into a childhood that the anime never so much as gestures toward. As the novels lay it out, Nanase once had a closest friend, a boy named Ayakairo, from a family called Matsuo, and that family's fate is bound to Ayanokoji in a way she has spent years misunderstanding. The chain of it runs like this, and it is worth telling slowly, because the whole of her character rests on it. Years ago, when Ayanokoji was still a child imprisoned inside the White Room, being shaped and tested and stripped of an ordinary life, it was a member of the Matsuo household, a butler in service to that family, who helped him escape. A single act of mercy, quietly given, that let one boy slip out of that place and into something like freedom. But mercy toward the White Room's most valuable subject is not forgiven. Ayanokoji's father, the architect of that entire institution, did not let the act go unanswered. In the years that followed, he turned the full weight of his resentment onto the Matsuo family, and he did not stop. He pursued them, wore them down, made their lives narrower and harder, so that Ayakairo, the butler's son and Nanase's dearest friend, was driven from one school to the next, never allowed to settle, never allowed to rest. The books do not soften what this cost. The butler, unable to carry what had been brought down on the people he loved, took his own life. And in time, worn thin by grief and by being hunted for kindness his family had shown, Ayakairo followed him. 2 lives quietly extinguished, as the long and patient revenge of a man who could not forgive a locked door being opened. There is a particular horror in the patience of it, and the novel does not let you look away from that patience. This was not a crime of a single furious moment. It was a slow thing, carried out over years, a wearing down rather than a blow, and that slowness is what makes it so hard to bear. A family was not struck once and left to recover. They were followed and pressured and denied peace again and again, until the weight of simply being pursued became more than the people inside it could hold. The man behind it did not need to raise a hand. He only needed to never stop, and to have the reach to make sure that stopping was never allowed. It is the same cold, unhurried will that shaped Ayanokoji himself inside the White Room, the will that treats human beings as problems to be managed until they yield, and it fell on the Matsuo family for the unforgivable sin of having once shown a trapped child a way out. Nanase was left holding all of that, a child's love turned into an adult's grief, with no one to place it on. And this is where the cruelty of her situation becomes almost unbearable, because she placed it on the wrong person. She came to believe that the boy who escaped, the boy whose freedom had set the whole tragedy in motion, was the one to blame. In her understanding, if Ayanokoji had never fled, if that door had never opened, then the Matsuo family would have been left alone and her friend would still be alive. So she carried her hatred toward him, toward the escaped boy, toward the name Ayanokoji, without yet understanding that the hand which destroyed the Matsuos was not the son's but the father's, and that the son had been just as much a prisoner, just as much a victim of that same relentless will. It is into this grief that the White Room's people reached, and this is the part that turns her from a sympathetic figure into a genuinely tragic one. The man acting as the school's head, the one advancing the father's interests, found Nanase's pain and used it. He offered her a path to what she wanted, or what she thought she wanted, dangling the promise that if she helped remove Ayanokoji from the school, she might finally be given answers, an acknowledgement, some kind of reckoning for what had happened to Ayakairo and his family. So her alliance with the forces hunting Ayanokoji was never really about 20 million points, and it was never really about following Hosen. It was grief carefully located and quietly aimed by someone who understood exactly how to use it. She was, in her own way, one more child being shaped by the White Room's hand, pointed at a target that had been chosen for her, believing the whole time that the choice was hers. The anime, having no window into any of this, can only give you her actions, and her actions on their own are ambiguous, even contradictory, in a way that must be quietly confusing to watch without the interior explanation. Because Nanase does not behave like a simple enemy. There is a moment, during the very confrontation where Hosen produces his knife, when she does something that makes no sense if you think of her as merely his accomplice. She steps between them. She puts her own body in the way, and she tells Hosen in effect that she cannot approve of his methods, that this is not the way. For a girl supposedly aligned with the boy holding the blade, it is a strange thing to do, and the anime lets it pass as a small, unexplained beat. The novel lets you understand it completely. She wants Ayanokoji dealt with, yes, but she has a line, and cruelty of that raw and physical kind sits on the wrong side of it. Her war with him is a matter of grief and principle as she understands them, not a matter of knives in a stairwell. She is willing to be his enemy, but she is not willing to be that. You can feel the same divided heart in the quieter meetings between the two of them, the moments where she and Ayanokoji sit and exchange what each of them knows, feeling out the shape of the other. She is not warm to him. At one point she calls him something close to a wicked and filthy person, and she means it, because in her understanding he is the root of everything she has lost. And yet even as she says it, she is telling him things, warning him in her way, revealing the bounty, letting slip that the reward is not really what moves her. The anime cannot hold this contradiction because it lives entirely in what is said between them and beneath what is said. On the page you are watching a girl argue with her own grief in real time, hating the person in front of her, while some quieter part of her is already uncertain whether her hatred is even pointed the right way. It is one of the most human things in this stretch of the story, and it is almost invisible on screen. What makes it heavier still is that Nanase is, underneath the mission she's been given, a fundamentally decent person, and the novel never lets you forget it. She's not cruel by nature. She does not enjoy any of this. She has simply been convinced, by her own pain and by a man who knew how to use it, that a terrible thing is also a just one, and so she carries out a campaign against someone while some steady, honest part of her keeps flinching at the methods and doubting the target. That is a very particular kind of suffering, to act against your own gentleness in the name of a love you cannot let go of. And it is the sort of thing that only really lives in interior narration, in the small hesitations and second thoughts that never make it to a person's face. Strip that away, as the anime must, and you are left with a girl who sometimes helps and sometimes hinders for reasons that seem to shift scene by scene. Restore it, and every one of those shifts becomes legible, each one a small movement in a war she is quietly losing against herself. All of this gathers slowly toward the island where her arc finally breaks open. Somewhere in the long survival exam, the careful distance between them collapses into direct confrontation, and Nanase moves against Ayanokoji at last, the way she has been preparing to for so long, and she loses. Not narrowly and not by luck, but completely, because she was never going to be his equal in that kind of contest, and because he had, as we have already seen, understood what she was from almost the first day. But the defeat is not the point. The point is what happens in its aftermath, when the fight is spent and there is nothing left to do but speak plainly. Because it is there, finally, that the truth she has been missing for years is set in front of her. That it was not Ayanokoji who destroyed the Matsuo family, that the boy she has hated was never the one who hunted her friend to his death, that the hand behind all of it belonged to the father, to the White Room itself, and that Ayanokoji, far from being the cause of her grief, was another child broken by the very same machine, a boy whose escape she had spent years resenting without ever asking what he had escaped from. Watch that moment land on her in the pages, and you understand why leaving it out changes everything. Years of hatred, carefully tended, suddenly have nowhere to stand. The person she came to destroy turns out to share the shape of her own wound, and Nanase, to her enormous credit, does not cling to the anger simply because it is familiar. She lets it move. She turns her resentment away from the boy in front of her and toward the true source of it, and in doing so she stops being his enemy and becomes something closer to an ally, even telling him, in her quiet way, that she will help him from here. The girl who was sent to destroy him ends this stretch of the story standing, unexpectedly, at his side. In the anime you can see the surface of that shift, the softening, the change in how she treats him. What you cannot see, without the interior the adaptation removed, is the full weight of what had to break inside her for it to happen, the years of misdirected grief finally set down, and it is that weight, that slow and painful correction of a lifelong mistake, that makes her one of the quietly unforgettable figures of the second year. It is worth naming what is genuinely lost when a character like this is flattened, because it is not a small thing. Without her history, Nanase becomes a plot device, a mysterious first year who opposes the hero and then, for reasons the anime cannot fully justify, stops. With her history restored, she becomes a mirror held up to Ayanokoji himself, another child fed into the White Room's long machinery of consequences, another life bent out of shape by the same man, arriving at the same school carrying the same buried question of who is really to blame for what was done to them. The two of them are, in a sense, survivors of the same disaster who spent months believing they were on opposite sides of it. That is a far richer and sadder thing than a simple rivalry, and it is exactly the layer that lives only in the pages. In the grief the anime had no room to speak aloud. And it is worth being honest that some of the finest detail of her past is drawn from the deeper reaches of the novels and the way readers have pieced it together, so a few of the smallest specifics are held more loosely than the central fact, which is not in doubt, that her hatred was real, that it was aimed at the wrong person, and that letting it go nearly cost her everything. So the mysterious girl beside the boy with the knife was never really a mystery at all. She was a grieving child who had been handed the wrong villain, and who found her way, at great cost, back to the truth. But she was not the only new face that arrived that spring carrying more than the anime chose to show. There were others among the first years whose stillness hid something, and where Nanase's secret was a sorrow, theirs was something colder and more deliberate, a pair of newcomers whose gentleness was a costume, and whose real purpose reached straight back into the white room that had made all of this pain in the first place. So let the sad girl rest now, reconciled at last, and turned softly toward the two who were smiling and lying from the very start. The first of them is a girl named Amasawa Ichika, and if Nanase's disguise was a stillness, Amasawa's is a brightness. Where Nanase is quiet, Amasawa is playful, teasing, quick with a smile and a light word, the kind of energetic and mischievous first year who seems to treat the whole school as a game she is enjoying. That is precisely how the anime presents her, as a cheerful, slightly troublesome newcomer who floats into Ayanokoji's orbit, needles him a little, and attaches herself to the situation without ever seeming like a genuine danger. And that impression, that lightness, is the most carefully constructed lie in the whole first semester, because underneath the playfulness Amasawa is something the anime is very slow to let you understand. She is a product of the White Room. She was raised in the same institution that shaped Ayanokoji, trained from childhood in the same ways, and when she chooses to be serious, her mind operates on something close to his own level. The giggling girl is a costume worn over a weapon, and the novels let you feel the weight of what is underneath in a way the adaptation only reaches at the very end. Consider the plain facts of her ability, the numbers the school itself assigns, because they quietly give her away to anyone paying attention. In the school's own assessment of its students, the measure that ranks each of them across the qualities that matter, Amasawa carries an A in academic ability, and just below that, an A- in the physical assessment. It is worth being precise about that, because it is easy to round her up in memory into a flat perfect score, and the truth is slightly more specific and slightly more interesting. She's not flawless on paper. She's simply, quietly, exceptional in both directions at once, brilliant in the classroom and formidable in the body, a combination that almost no ordinary student possesses. And the physical side of her is more dangerous than even those letters suggest, because Ayanokoji himself, taking her measure, privately rates her capacity for a real fight as sitting above what the strongest fighters in the older year could manage together. That is his own assessment, offered in his interior voice, so it should be held as his judgment rather than a hard fact stamped on a page, but it tells you how seriously he takes her. He is looking at a smiling first-year girl, and quietly concluding that, in a genuine physical confrontation, she would be more than a match for the school's established brawlers combined. To feel why that unsettles him, you have to understand what it means in this story to meet another person who came out of the White Room. For almost the entire series up to this point, Ayanokoji has been alone in a very particular way. He has been the only one in every room who was made the way he was made, the only one who sees the board the way he sees it, surrounded by clever people who are nonetheless playing a fundamentally simpler game than the one running behind his eyes. Amasawa breaks that solitude, and not gently. Suddenly there is someone across from him who was trained in the same place, who recognizes his methods because they are her methods too, who cannot be fooled by ordinariness because she invented her own version of the same disguise. The novels let you feel the strange charge of that recognition, two people circling each other while pretending, for the benefit of everyone watching, to be a board transfer student and a giggling girl, each perfectly aware that the other is not what they claim. It is one of the most electric undercurrents of the whole first semester, and it is almost entirely interior, a game played in glances and implications, which is exactly why the anime, able to show only the surface of their interactions, lets nearly all of it evaporate. None of that menace survives cleanly into the anime, and the clearest example is the way her role in the knife scheme is quietly diffused on screen. You may remember from earlier that the violent boy's plan with the blade did not appear from nowhere, that Ayanokoji had anticipated it because a trail had been left for him to find. That trail was Amasawa's work. In the novels, she is not a bystander to the first-year plot against Ayanokoji, she is one of its engineers. She deliberately maneuvered herself into partnership with Sudo, the loyal and hot-tempered member of Ayanokoji's class, and she did so precisely to manufacture the closeness that the frame would need, positioning the pieces so that a confrontation could be engineered and blame could be steered. She was involved in the knife itself, in its being obtained and made ready. And in a detail that tells you everything about how her mind works, she left the evidence of that knife deliberately visible, asking after it in a way that a careful person would later be able to trace, almost as though she wanted the possibility of the plan being seen through to exist. Whether that was overconfidence, or a game she was playing for her own amusement, or a test of Ayanokoji himself, the novels leave beautifully ambiguous. But the point is that her partnering with Pseudo, which the anime presents as a neutral, almost random pairing, is in the source a calculated act of sabotage, one more move in a quiet war, and she later admits as much to Ayanokoji directly, dropping the cheerful mask just far enough to let him see the operator beneath it. That admission matters because it is the moment the costume slips, and the novels build toward it with a patience the anime cannot match. For most of the first semester, Amasawa keeps up the performance, the teasing brightness, the harmless seeming interest, and only in glimpses does the other things show through, a coldness in a glance, a competence that does not fit the girl she is pretending to be, a familiarity with Ayanokoji's true nature that an ordinary first year could not possibly have. And then, in the long crucible of the island, the mask comes off entirely, and she reveals herself for what she is, a fellow graduate of the White Room, sent into the same school for reasons bound up with the same people who have been reaching for Ayanokoji all along. The anime does arrive at this reveal, because the reveal is part of the season's climax, but what the anime cannot give you is the slow, delicious dread of the build-up, the accumulation of small wrong notes that, in the reading, make you suspect her long before she confirms it. On the page, the reveal is the release of a tension that has been quietly tightening for hundreds of pages. On the screen, with the interior suspicion stripped away, it can feel more like a twist that arrives than a truth that was always there. There is a quiet tragedy folded into Amasawa as well, though she wears it far more lightly than Nanase does, and the novels only let it show at the edges. She is, after all, a child who was made, not raised, shaped by the same institution that broke so many others, and her brightness may itself be a kind of armor, a way of moving through a life that was never allowed to be soft. The story does not sentimentalize her, and neither should we, because she is genuinely dangerous and genuinely willing to do harm. But there is something underneath the giggling that the interior narration lets you glimpse, a person performing lightness because lightness is useful, in a way that rhymes uncomfortably with how Ayanokoji himself performs ordinariness. They are both wearing costumes stitched in the same place. Hers is just brighter, and the anime, seeing only the brightness, mistakes the costume for the girl. The second of the pair is a boy named Yagami Takuya, and he is in some ways the most quietly unsettling of all of them, precisely because he gives you the least to hold on to. Where Amasawa is loud and Nanase is sad, Yagami is pleasant. He is polite, gentle, easy to like, the very picture of a well-mannered and gifted student, and he is often spoken of as a genuine talent, the kind of newcomer teachers and classmates alike are glad to have. The anime accepts that surface almost completely, presenting him as an agreeable and clever first year, and in doing so it flattens away the thing that makes him so interesting in the reading, which is the growing, creeping sense that his pleasantness is too smooth, too calibrated, that every warm word is placed rather than felt. Begin again with the plain facts, the school records, because they undercut the modest surface. Yagami is not merely a good student. Across the school's full assessment of ability, he stands at the very top of the entire incoming group of new first years, his academic mark reaching an A at the highest end of that scale, edging out even the others we have met, with strong marks across the other qualities as well. He is, by the numbers, the single most capable of the newcomers, and yet he carries it with a lightness that invites everyone to underestimate him, deflecting attention away from himself even as he quietly outranks the people around him. The anime lets him be pleasant. The novels let you notice that his pleasantness is a strategy, that a boy this able, choosing so consistently to seem ordinary and agreeable, is doing something deliberate with the impression he makes. And when you watch what he actually does, beneath the smile, the calculation becomes clear. Yagami moves through the semester like someone playing a longer game than anyone around him realizes. He attaches himself strategically to Kushida, the girl in Ayanokoji's class with her own well-hidden darker side, and he does it with purpose, making the arrangement between them into a condition, a lever, something that ties the cooperation of his class to an outcome he wants. He works quietly toward the same end so many others are working toward, the removal of Ayanokoji, and he does it not with knives or open threats but with suggestions, with information, with the careful positioning of other people. He proposes, for instance, that the confrontation between Ayanokoji and Nanase be recorded, turned into leverage, a piece of evidence to be used, which is exactly the kind of patient, indirect, deniable move that the loud schemers never think of. And he rarely dirties his own hands, preferring to root his intentions through intermediaries, passing instructions along a chain of other students, so that his own fingerprints stay off the actual deed. The anime, without the interior framing, cannot make you suspicious of any of this. It simply shows a helpful boy being helpful. The novels drop breadcrumb after breadcrumb until you begin to watch him the way you would watch a smiling stranger who knows a little too much about you. The choice of Kushida as his partner deserves a closer look, because it shows how precisely Yagami reads the people around him, and how much of that reading the anime leaves unspoken. Kushida, in Ayanokoji's own class, is a person with a carefully buried second self, someone who wears warmth and popularity as a public face while carrying a private, corrosive wish to see certain people, Ayanokoji among them, gone from the school. She is, in other words, a loaded weapon already sitting inside his class, and most people never sense it because her disguise is so complete. Yagami senses it. Of all the students he could have aligned himself with, he reaches for the one whose hidden hostility toward Ayanokoji matches his own aims, and he offers her exactly the kind of arrangement that lets her act on that hostility while keeping her own hands clean. It is a quiet, almost surgical instinct, the ability to look across a crowd and find the one concealed grudge that can be turned to use, and it tells you far more about Yagami than any of his pleasant words do. The anime shows the two of them cooperating and lets it look like an ordinary partnership between agreeable students. The novels let you understand that it is a predator recognizing another predator and choosing her precisely because of the darkness she keeps hidden. Here, though, we reach a place where honesty about the material matters, and where a spoiler-careful telling has to hold its tongue on purpose, because Yagami is the one figure of this pair whose deepest truth, the story of this first semester, keeps deliberately folded away. Amasawa shows her real face before the season is over. Yagami does not. Whatever the full shape of his intentions turns out to be, the events adapted here stop before that shape is allowed to complete, and even in the novels covering this stretch, his innermost card stays unturned, held back for a later part of the story that has not yet been reached. So it would be a disservice, and frankly a mistelling, to hand you a conclusion the season itself withholds. What can be said, and said accurately, is that the anime presents Yagami as far more harmless than the novels do, that the reading experience is one of steadily mounting unease around a boy who seems too perfect to be true, and that the story is very consciously keeping something about him in reserve. If you finish the season with the faint feeling that you have not been told everything about the polite genius, that feeling is correct, and it is exactly the feeling the anime, by taking his pleasantness at face value, quietly denies you. What binds these two together and separates them from Nanase is the coldness of their deception. Nanase's disguise was grief, a real sorrow misdirected by a manipulator. Amasawa and Yagami are in their different registers, genuine operatives, products, or agents of the same institution that has been the source of so much of this pain, wearing warmth as a tool rather than feeling it. And the great loss in the anime's flattening of them is the loss of dramatic irony, that particular pleasure of knowing, or suspecting, more than the characters on screen do. In the reading, you spend the first semester quietly holding your breath around the bright girl and the pleasant boy, sensing the operators beneath the students, waiting to see when and how the masks will slip. In the watching, without that interior suspicion planted in you, they can simply seem like more classmates until the moment the story forces the issue. The information is the same. The experience is entirely different, and the difference is precisely the layer the adaptation had no room to keep. It is worth dwelling on that loss for a moment, because dramatic irony is not a small ingredient in a story like this one. It is close to the main course. So much of what makes Classroom of the Elite compelling is the gap between what the reader knows and what the characters on the page know, the tension of watching people move confidently through situations you can see are traps, or of recognizing a lie that its target accepts as truth. When the interior voice is present, the reader is quietly let in on secrets the cast has not yet uncovered, and the whole first semester becomes a slow, pleasurable dread, an unhurried waiting for things you have already half-guessed to finally come into the open. Strip the interior away, and the audience is dropped back to the level of the ordinary students, learning things only as they are announced, surprised by reveals that careful readers saw building for 100 pages. Neither experience is wrong exactly, but they are profoundly different, and the calmer, richer, more suspenseful of the two is the one that lives in the novels, in the quiet knowledge the anime cannot pass along. To watch the season is to be told a series of surprises. To read it is to watch a set of inevitabilities arrive, which is, for this kind of story, a deeper and more satisfying pleasure. There is a larger shape behind all three of them that the anime's flattening tends to hide, and it is worth lifting into view, softly, before we move on. These newcomers are not simply a collection of individual rivals who happen to dislike the same boy. They are taken together, evidence of how far the White Room's reach extends, and how patient its hand is. One child was found and aimed through her grief. 2 more were placed into the school directly, shaped by the institution itself, sent in wearing friendly faces with a single quiet purpose folded inside them. An entire year group was turned, by a hidden reward, into a field of potential hunters. When you hold all of that at once, the first semester stops looking like ordinary school politics and starts looking like what it actually is: a slow, coordinated attempt by a powerful and unseen force to reclaim one person, reaching into a supposedly ordinary high school and quietly bending its youngest students toward that end. The novels let you feel the scale and the coldness of it, the sense of a vast machine turning far off stage. The anime, seeing only the individual students and not the interior threads that tie them to that machine, gives you the pieces without quite giving you the pattern, and the pattern is the frightening part. So the new faces of that spring were never quite what they seemed: a grieving girl aimed at the wrong target, a laughing operative with a fighter's hands, and a gentle genius holding a secret even the season would not open. But the anime's quiet subtractions were not only a matter of hidden hearts and buried histories. A great deal of what the reading gives and the watching loses is smaller and more structural than that, less about who these people secretly are and more about the slow, patient machinery of how the story actually moves, the long conversations compressed into single scenes, the careful rules that give the exams their weight, the small human beats that fall between the large events. So let the masks rest where they lie for now, and turn gently toward the quieter things, the details between the frames, and everything the anime smoothed away in the spaces where nothing seemed to be happening at all. The clearest place to begin is with a scene you almost certainly remember, because it was one of the season's tense early set pieces, the meeting in the karaoke room. In the anime, the shape of it is simple and sharp. Horikita, leading Ayanokoji's class, comes to an arrangement with the first years, sitting across from the loud and dangerous Hosen in that small bright room, and the meeting curdles. She refuses to place herself beneath him, insisting on an alliance between equals rather than a class made subordinate. He makes it clear he will offer nothing without payment. The talk breaks down, spills out of the room, moves to the space behind the first-year dormitory, and from there tips into the brawl and the knife and everything that followed. As a piece of television it works, a single escalating confrontation that carries you from a tense conversation to sudden violence in one unbroken slide. What the novels show, and what the anime quietly folds away, is that this single confrontation was never a single confrontation at all. It was the visible end of a much longer, slower process, a negotiation that had unfolded across multiple approaches and multiple failures before it ever reached that karaoke room. In the reading, Horikita and the others do not simply walk in and collide with Hosen once. They try and are rebuffed and reconsider, and try again from another angle, feeling out the first years, testing what an alliance might cost and what it might be worth, retreating to rethink when a door closes and returning with a changed approach. The karaoke meeting in the source is not the whole story of the negotiation. It is the point where a long and patient effort finally runs out of road. The anime, needing to move, compresses all of that circling and failing and reapproaching into one clean scene, and in doing so it changes the meaning of the moment. What was written as the collapse of a sustained diplomatic effort becomes, on screen, something closer to a sudden argument that goes wrong. That compression costs more than it might first appear, because it is largely Horikita who pays for it. Across this stretch of the novels, she's being quietly transformed, growing out of the sharp, isolated, prideful girl of the first year into something steadier and more capable, a genuine leader learning to carry a class on her own judgment rather than leaning on the boy beside her. That growth lives precisely in the slow scenes, in the patience of a difficult negotiation, in the moments where she has to absorb a refusal and decide what to do next without anyone rescuing her. When those scenes are collapsed into a single confrontation, her development is collapsed along with them. The anime gives you a Horikita who is assertive in one room on one evening. The novels give you a Horikita who earns that assertiveness across days of quiet, unglamorous effort, and it is that earning, that visible growth through repetition and setback, that the adaptation cannot spare the minutes to show. She is written with more interiority than the screen can hold, more doubt and more resolve moving beneath her composed surface, and the reader comes away with a much fuller sense of the person she is becoming. It is worth being fair to the adaptation here, because this particular season was, by most honest accounts, a more faithful and more patient piece of work than the ones that came before it. The earlier seasons, especially in the rougher stretches of the middle of the story, cut and rushed a great deal, sometimes to the real detriment of the plot. This season took more care, kept more of the source, and gave many of its scenes more room to land, and if you felt while watching that it moved at a gentler and fuller pace than you remembered from before, you were right to feel that. So none of what we are walking through is a complaint that the adaptation was lazy. It is simply that even a careful adaptation is still a compression, and the things that get compressed first are always the same kind of things: the slow ones, the internal ones, the connective ones, and it is worth knowing what they were even when the trimming was done with a gentle hand. The same quiet smoothing happens to the rules of the exams themselves, and while that might sound like the driest possible thing to lose, it matters more than it seems, because in this series the rules are the battlefield. Consider the written examination that opens the semester, the one built around pairing each of the second years with a first-year partner. In the anime it passes relatively quickly, a test to be gotten through. In the novels its structure is laid out with real care, because the structure is the trap. Each second-year student is tied to a first-year, their fates bound together through the combined result they produce, with the threat of expulsion hanging over anyone who falls too low, and crucially, the danger reaching the partner as well as the student. That binding is the whole reason the first years have leverage over their seniors in the first place, the whole reason a hostile junior becomes a genuine threat rather than a mere annoyance. When the mechanism is glossed over, the tension leaks out of it, because you cannot fully feel the danger of a trap whose teeth you were never shown. The great survival exam on the island is the richer example, and there the lost detail is considerable. The novels are patient about how that exam actually works, and the patience is what makes the 2 weeks feel so heavy. Groups move across the island trying to reach a newly designated area each day, and the rewards are precise and unforgiving, the first group to arrive taking the largest share of points, the second and third taking steadily less, and any latecomer earning only a small token for having arrived at all. Miss too many of those designated areas in a row and you are penalized. Fail to answer the twice daily roll calls, morning and evening, and points are stripped away. Groups are limited in size, and larger ones are bound by rules about their makeup, and hanging over all of it is the knowledge that the lowest placed groups face expulsion at the end, while a group that gives up entirely and withdraws forfeits everything it earned. When you understand all of that, the island stops being a vague ordeal of heat and hunger, and becomes a precise grinding contest where every missed signal and every skipped roll call carries a real and calculable cost. The anime lets you feel that the island is hard. The novels let you understand exactly why it is hard, and that understanding is what turns physical endurance into strategy, and what makes a quiet decision about where to walk on a given morning into something genuinely tense. Once you can see the rules clearly, you can also see the genuine dilemmas they force on everyone taking the exam, and this is another quiet casualty of the compression. The choice of how large a group to travel in, for example, is not a simple one. Large group can dominate the race to each day's designated area and split the labor of survival, but it must share its rewards among more people, and is bound by additional constraints on how it is composed, including requirements about its balance that push students into social maneuvering they might otherwise avoid. A small group or a lone traveler keeps every point it earns and answers to no one, but shoulders the entire burden alone, with no one to share the watches or the walking or the risk. Every student on that island is quietly solving a version of that same equation, weighing companionship against independence, safety against reward, and the novels let you sit inside those calculations in a way that makes the whole exam feel like a vast, slow game of resource management played across 2 weeks of exhaustion. It is precisely the kind of patient strategic texture that a season of television has no choice but to thin out, and thinning it out is what turns a tense contest of judgment into what can look, from the outside, like a lot of teenagers walking around a hot island. It is in that fuller understanding of the rules that a figure like Koenji, who tops the exam, takes on his real weight, and it is worth a gentle word here, because the anime shows the outcome without quite showing the meaning. To finish first across 2 weeks of that grinding system, against groups organized and desperate and pushing themselves to their limits, while doing it largely alone and on his own strange terms, is a genuinely staggering feat, and in the novels, framed by a full understanding of how punishing the exam is, it lands as such. It reshapes how you see Koenji entirely, forcing you to take seriously a person the story has mostly let you dismiss as a self-absorbed eccentric. On screen, without the full weight of the mechanics behind it, his victory can feel like a quirk of the plot. In the reading, it is a quiet earthquake, a moment where a character you had filed away reveals a capability that reorders your sense of the entire year group. Beyond these larger structures, there is a whole texture of smaller things that simply falls away in adaptation, the connective tissue that a novel can afford and a season of television cannot. There are the little internal asides, the moments where a character's private reaction to an ordinary event tells you something about who they are. There are the quieter conversations that do not advance the plot but deepen a relationship, the small kindnesses and small frictions between classmates that make the group feel like a real community rather than a set of chess pieces. There are the pauses, the moments of rest between the large events, where the story simply breathes and lets its people be people for a while. None of these are dramatic enough to survive the tightening that adaptation requires, and so, one by one, they are trimmed, and no single cut is a tragedy. But their absence adds up. The accumulated weight of all those small, removed moments is the difference between a world you visit and a world you live in, and the novels, with room to keep them, quietly build the fuller world. And this, in the end, is the gentlest and most honest way to understand what the anime left out across the whole of this season. It is not that the adaptation is careless, because it is not, and it is not that the events were changed beyond recognition, because they were not. It is that a novel and a season of television are simply different vessels, and the novel holds the slow things, the interior things, the patient things, while the screen must keep moving. What was cut was rarely the events themselves. It was the reasoning beneath the events, the histories beneath the faces, the long effort beneath the sudden outcome, the careful rules beneath the contest, and the quiet human spaces beneath the drama. All the parts, in other words, where nothing seems to be happening, which are so often the parts where everything is. If you have watched the season and felt that you understood it, you were not wrong, because you did understand its shape. But there is a deeper and slower version of the same story waiting underneath, and it is a calmer, richer thing than the surface suggests, less a series of shocks and more a patient unfolding of minds and motives and rules, the kind of story that rewards being taken slowly. It is, in a sense, a story built for exactly this hour, for a quiet room and a tired mind and no particular hurry to be anywhere. So if any of what we have wandered through tonight has stayed with you, let it settle gently, and know that the fuller telling is always there, patient and unchanged, whenever you feel like returning to it. For now, though, there is nothing left to solve and nothing left to watch for. The knife has long since been put away. The island has emptied of its exhausted groups. The masks have slipped and the truths beneath them have been spoken, and the quiet boy at the center of it all has, once again, stepped back out of the light he never wanted. So let the school go dark and silent. Let the second year drift on somewhere beyond the edge of the page, and let yourself rest, unhurried and untroubled, as the story quietly keeps its own counsel and waits, as it always does, for whenever you are ready to return. Good night.